the main speaker here today. That is going to be Solange Durão, who will speak to you on the topic of what is special about a systematic review. But I thought would be helpful is just to make a few introductory remarks to create the context for Solange to talk further about systematic reviews. And Michelle, I'm now trying to move the slides, and they're refusing to obey me. So I am not really sure what the problem is. There we go. Okay, thank you. So let me start with the opening lines of A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, and it was the age of foolishness. And so it goes on, you know, the text. And when I looked at this, I couldn't but help think that, you know, this was written in 1859, and today these words are probably just as relevant. We're living at a time when perhaps more than any time in history, we have accumulated more knowledge, but at the very same time, the amount of false beliefs, fake news, untruths have also increased exponentially. And it seems like sometimes we either don't know the difference between fact and fiction, or we refuse to accept that there is a difference. And so at your leisure, you might want to have a look at this clip where Kellyanne Conway, who works for Donald Trump, introduces the whole idea of alternative facts. So she was challenged about untruths that were being promoted, and she recast them as not falsehoods, but as alternative facts, which is the first time I've actually heard somebody, you know, refer to information as alternative facts. So that's very interesting. So that a lot of that is going on at the moment, and I just want to take a step back here and just reflect a little bit on how do we know the things that we know? How do we know them to be true? And I would argue that there are two sets of inputs. The first is what I would say are the things that we receive through our senses. So there may be personal experiences, our traditions, the things that other people tell us. It could be a friend, or it could be your granny who told you something. Or it could be an expert on a particular subject, or you could be getting it directly from research evidence. So the things that we perceive through our senses. But equally important are the things that we believe to be true. So we know certain things because we simply believe them to be true, or we have a theory about why this is true, or we have an ideology or worldview that says this is fact because you know, I say so, or somebody else that I respect says so. So these are the things that we believe to be true. Now there is an interaction between these two sets of things. So while we would want to hope that, you know, in this particular context that we're discussing today, we would want to believe that research evidence would lead to our beliefs and our claims and our actions. But in fact, sometimes it works the other way around, where we start with the belief and we interpret or reinterpret what we receive through our senses based on our beliefs. So, you know, there's that saying, seeing is believing. Well, sometimes it's also believing is seeing, so it can work either way. So let us just give a few quick examples of how that might work. So we might want to ask, you know, I have a headache, you know, does this pill work? Does this treatment work for my headache? And here's how belief can play into it. So here's a quote from Sir Peter Medawar from 1967. He says, if a person is A, poorly, which marks him as particularly British, B, receives treatment intended to make him better, and C, gets better, no power of reasoning known to medical science can convince him that it may not have been the treatment that restored his health. So the issue here is, because I believe, because I've seen this correlation between taking the medicine and getting better, I believe that that correlation is in fact causation, that the medication actually caused me to get better. Yet we know that there could be a whole range of other possible explanations. And so this kind of thing does not only impact us as individuals at our levels of either lay people, professionals, but also very high levels of government. And so we know the saga around HIV/AIDS in South Africa under Minister Tshabalala Msimang and President Mbeki, how they believed certain things were patently untrue, that were not supported by any scientific evidence. So the quote here from the minister: "Shall I repeat garlic? Shall I talk about beetroot? Shall I talk about lemon? These delay the development of HIV to AIDS defining conditions." And that's the truth. So firm belief in the truth based purely on belief. And so, excuse my language, but this is the actual title of the book. We end up, because of our belief systems, we end up, and the way we process information as a result of those belief systems, we end up sometimes believing bullshit, things that are not true. So just to say that, I've used that really horrific example from our government and the Department of Health believing the wrong things when it came to dealing with HIV/AIDS, and I'm pleased to say that our approach now is very different. This is an example. We're trying to figure out here whether chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine is helpful for the treatment of COVID-19. And what this is, how they're approaching it, is there's a guideline panel. People like Tamara Credo, who I'm sure you've met from Cochrane, who's part of that. And they are, in order to inform the decision and the guideline, they are digging into the research, they are systematically reviewing the evidence in order to come up with the correct answers. But life is never as simple as that, is it? And so, and this is the whole point, and this is probably the key slide today. It's at least in my part of the presentation, and I'm sure also very important for what Solange is about to say. While we say, yes, research evidence matters, we know that it's not as simple as just finding the evidence and looking at it and knowing what the answer is. There are three major problems. One is that it's difficult sometimes to find the relevant evidence because they're hidden, or because it's simply not published, or whatever it is. Secondly, evidence comes in all shapes and sizes, and they're not all created equal, and one has to be careful what evidence you select to answer a particular question. And then the third, when we're evaluating that evidence, you cannot do that in a sloppy way, because that will also lead you to wrong conclusions. There needs to be a degree of rigor in terms of how you evaluate the evidence. So some examples. So this is what I call the danger of the single study. Here's a study from the Netherlands. This study shows that couples who wear socks during sex are more satisfied. I don't know who would do a study like this, but nevertheless, the study was published. And so it's a single study with sensational findings. And, so this is really just here to tell us, to remind us that, very often we can be misled by a single study, especially when the findings are sensational. And the problem with a single study, very often these tend to be small studies. and small studies are prone to the play of chance. So by chance, you can get one result or the other. And so to select one study and draw conclusions from that one study is always a dangerous thing. But studies, besides being small, studies can also be poorly designed. So this was an example of the Scared Straight program, which is a program of rehabilitating juvenile offenders, and it was used pretty extensively in the United States and also in the UK, where teenagers who commit offences are taken into prison, and they are confronted by hardened criminals who scream and shout at them and tell them how, where they will end up and how bad it is in prison. And they were supposed to then be scared straight, i.e. they would not go on to committing further offences. That was at least the theory behind it, and that was firmly believed. In fact, people reviewed the then evidence, which was very bad evidence, and they concluded that it cut reoffending by 50%, which is a very, very big effect. And so a movie was even made about this that won an Oscar. But yet, years later, when more carefully designed studies were done, and summarized in a systematic review, what they found was that, in fact, the Scared Straight program made you more likely to reoffend rather than less likely. So we were completely wrong in the early years when we thought that this was an effective intervention. This is really, I just want to show a slide which makes a point that you can find a study to your satisfaction on almost anything. So these are studies that are trying to look at, does this food cause cancer? And on the left-hand side, you see the different types of food, from wine right through to beef, and then there's a line right in the middle. So any dot. Every red dot here describes a particular finding, a specific study. If the dot is to the left of that vertical line, it indicates that that food protects against cancer. If the dot is to the right of the line, then it shows that the food causes cancer. So can you see that the dots extend all the way from extreme left to extreme right? So depending on what your belief is, you can selectively pick any of those studies and make a case that there is evidence that this food, whether it be coffee or butter or whatever it is, causes or protects against cancer. So I think this is a very powerful slide that reminds us of the need to be very careful, and that we are all prone to cherry picking studies that we like. And we do, and this is sometimes also described in terms of confirmation bias. We like studies that support what we already believe. So again, back to that interplay between belief and evidence. And so on the left, in the left circle, you see what represents our beliefs. On the right circle, you see the facts and evidence. And so what we like to focus on is that overlap between the two, because that's when the facts support our beliefs. So any facts or evidence outside of that intersection there, we can sometimes completely ignore. And that is what is called confirmation bias. We see the results that we like and we share those results because they confirm our evidence. Which brings me to the last slide before handing over to Solange. And that is really just to say that while it is true that truth is best pursued by evaluating evidence, how we evaluate that evidence is critical. So as it says on the slide, the trustworthiness of the evidence depends on the extent to which it was determined by credible processes. And that is the essence of what a systematic review tries to be, a credible process. So with that, thank you for listening, and I'm handing back to Solange.
Thank you, Jimmy. just to say, if anyone has a burning question, we'll try and save all the questions for the end, but if you do have a burning question you want to put into chat in the meantime, that's also fine, and I'll monitor to see if anyone does put anything there. But we'll go straight on to Solange. So I'm just going to make her the presenter, and she will be able to take over.
Hi, Michelle, can you see my screen?
Yes,
can you see the presentation?
Yeah, we can.
All right. Thank you. Sorry, this is a bad moment to unmute myself. So thank you, Jimmy, for that introduction. And really now I'd like to talk about in the next part of this presentation. Sorry, just a second. All right, so in this presentation, it's really just to expand on the topic of what a systematic review is, why they are important, and what's the rationale behind doing systematic reviews, and go over a little some of the characteristics that distinguish it from your traditional narrative reviews that you may find in the literature. So my slide is not moving. Okay. So I'm sure that many of us have had the experience, and especially you as health journalists, and trying to find or access research on the internet, and you type something and you get thousands and thousands of records. And it can literally feel that like getting information off the internet is like taking a drink from a fire hydrant, and it can become really difficult to understand and to figure out which studies do I pick, which research is trustworthy, what do I read, what don't I read. And one approach for dealing with this is to access synthesized research evidence. When we talk about research synthesis, we're talking about research that's gone through. So it's a process through which 2 or more research studies are assessed with the objective of summarizing the evidence that relates to a particular question. So instead of reading 50 papers on a particular topic, you try to find synthesized research evidence on that particular topic that summarizes those 50 papers. And this can make the process of dealing with this overload of information much bearable. There are other reasons why research synthesis is important. So the man in the picture here, Sir Ian Chalmers, was the founder of the Cochrane collaboration back in 1992. And he said, the results of a particular research study cannot be interpreted with any confidence unless they've been considered together with the results of other studies addressing the same or similar questions. And this really alludes to the principle that science is cumulative, and you have to look at what has been done before you do new things, or to look at what a new study that has been published. And through the process of synthesizing the research that has been done on a topic, you are able to then evaluate the results of a given study in the context of what has been done before. The dangers of not doing this can be, for example, that you continue to give a drug or a treatment that is harmful long after it could have been proven that it was dangerous and it should be stopped. Or it can delay introducing beneficial treatments until long after they could have been proven to be beneficial. So to give an example, I'll talk about a review that was done on this drug called aprotinin, which is given to patients who are undergoing heart surgery, and it's to change their need for blood transfusion around the time of the operation. So there was a review that Ferguson and colleagues did in 2005, and they included on this drug, and they included 64 trials conducted from 1987 until 2002. And what they found in the review is that by 1992, after 12 trials had been conducted, it could already be proven that that drug was effective at preventing the need for blood transfusions for patients that were undergoing heart surgery. However, nobody synthesized the research that had been done at that point. And what happened is that in the next decade, another 54 studies were carried out, another 54 trials that are looking at the same exact question. So there's lots of patients that didn't receive the drug that they should have received. They were put on placebo, lots of resources spent on trials that were unnecessary. Another reason why research synthesis is important is that it helps us make sense of research. Because you're looking at a comprehensive overview of evidence that's looking at a particular question, it can sometimes highlight or help make sense and understand, you know, why are you seeing different findings across studies that have different populations, or that are conducted in different settings, or that use slightly different methods. So it can help us have a better understanding of why the findings are different, and when there is a similarity in findings across different contexts, across different settings, then it gives us a little bit of ground for generalizing those findings. Research synthesis also obviously help us understand what are the gaps that still exist in the knowledge base that need to be filled by new research. As I said, you have a comprehensive body of evidence on what has been done up until a particular point that has looking at a particular question, and you will then be able to understand, you know, what are the questions for which we have conclusive evidence, and what are the questions for which we don't, and therefore we need to do more primary research on that. In fact, these days, in order for an ethics board to approve a new trial, you need to show that you've done a systematic review and that your trial is going to fill a gap in the knowledge, and you're not just duplicating or repeating studies that are unnecessary. But when we talk about research synthesis and the benefits, there's an underlying assumption, at least when I was speaking, that this has been done correctly. And you will see in the literature that there are different terms that can be referred to, alluded to in terms linked to research synthesis. Things like literature reviews, traditional reviews, narrative reviews, systematic reviews, meta-analyses. And it's important to be able to distinguish between these different terms because they don't all, they're not all conducted in the same way, and they don't all mean the same thing. So I'll talk a bit about traditional literature reviews now, before I speak about the systematic reviews. So traditional literature reviews are usually qualitative narrative summaries of evidence on a particular topic. They're usually written by an expert in the field, and they typically involve informal and subjective methods to collect and interpret the information. So because of this, because the methods are subjective and informal, there are often a lot of shortcomings related to these types of reviews. This approach is potentially biased, can lead to false conclusions, and potentially serious consequences. And then one of these shortcomings that I'm talking about is the personal bias or the file drawer bias. And this relates to what Jimmy mentioned about cherry picking and confirmation bias. Because this is where somebody writes a review that often just includes studies that reflect their own perspective and their own viewpoints on something. There's this quote that I like from Caveman from 2000 that says, "The invited review, or my field from my standpoint, written by me using only my data and my ideas and citing only my publications." So it just gives it shows that this kind of review where you're cherry picking what studies you include in the review will give you a skewed version of what the evidence truly says. You're only putting in what actually proves what you want to say. And an example of a narrative review was Linus Pauling's review on vitamin C and its benefit for preventing the common cold. Another issue, another drawback of these types of reviews is what we call database bias. So let's say we want to do a study looking at whether vitamin C helps prevent the common cold. Can you see my cursor? Michelle?
No, no, we can't. And we're actually getting your notes
sorry.
as well. But I didn't want to disturb you. But I think it's fine. Don't worry.
That's strange because I can change. And now?
Now we know it. I don't think it was bothering anybody though.
Okay. Sorry about that. You should have told me in the beginning.
I didn't want to disrupt the flow.
Right, it's okay. And if I show my cursor now, it still doesn't show.
Yes, we can see it. Yeah.
Okay. So let's say we want to do a review looking at the effects of vitamin C for preventing the common cold. In theory, these will be all the studies in this block. This blue block at the top would be all the studies on that question. Part of those are ongoing, the others are completed. Of those that are completed, some have been published and some have not. Of those that are published, some have been published as abstracts or theses, while others have been published in journals. Of those published in journals, you may have those that have published in journals that are indexed in Medline, which is a bibliographic database of life sciences and biomedical information, or they may have been published in journals not indexed in Medline. Of those that are indexed in Medline, you will type in your search in Medline, and this is the pool of studies that you may find when you search Medline alone. And if you do that for a review, you are missing out on all these yellow studies over here. So this alludes to the danger of only looking at one database, but not only that, so a review that only looks at one database is not looking comprehensively enough, and it would not be a good quality review. But narrative reviews or traditional reviews don't tend to actually tell you where they looked, which databases they looked, how they identified the studies to include in the review in the first place. So it would even be a step down from just searching in one database alone. So this also introduces what we call publication bias. So this is a table from a study where they tracked the studies that were approved to be conducted in 3 institutions in the US, UK, and Australia. So basically, they looked at what studies had been approved to be conducted, and they followed it up to see which of these studies had been published or not. And what they found is that after 8 years or so, on average, there was quite a lot of these studies that were conducted, but that ended up not being published. Why are studies not being published? Meta-research has shown that there is evidence that studies that have negative results or disappointing results are less likely to be published in journals, they're less likely to be published in English, they're less likely to be published quickly or published more than once. So we know then that if we just focus on studies that have been published in a review, we might be looking at a very skewed representation of the evidence, because we might just be looking at studies that show positive results or interesting results, and we're not looking at those that have negative or disappointing results. And ideally, if you want to have a comprehensive view of the evidence base, you need to be putting all of these together and looking at all of them together. And narrative reviews usually don't go to the trouble of looking for unpublished studies. Another issue, which also Jimmy mentioned, is about the poor quality of research. So we know that even just because a study is published in a peer-reviewed journal does not mean it is high-quality research. This is quotes from the 4th Congress on Peer Review in Biomedical Publication, where they say that medical journals are full of serious methodological errors. Journal editors are giving no time, energy, and thought to their craft, and studies are being published that reach false conclusions. So a study being published in a peer-reviewed journal is not a guarantee of quality, and it is essential, if any of these studies is included in a review, to assess their methodological quality. And this is something narrative reviews don't do. In a narrative review, you won't find an assessment of the studies included for their methodological quality. And so you might be you don't know whether that information is trustworthy or not. if you don't do a quality assessment. And you might just be reaching false conclusions in a review because the original studies that are included in the review are not valid, are not the truth because of methodological flaws. So how do we make reviews more reliable? This is where we want to look for systematic reviews. And Cochrane reviews are there because they are systematic reviews. They're just produced by the Cochrane collaboration, but you have this high quality systematic reviews that are also non-Cochrane reviews. But the Cochrane reviews are your standard in terms of quality, the highest standard in terms of quality. So what are systematic reviews? They are a review in which bias has been reduced by the systematic identification, appraisal, synthesis, and if relevant, statistical aggregation of all relevant studies on a specific topic according to a predetermined and explicit method. So the key words here are systematic and explicit. So there is a process to find the studies, to identify which are relevant for the review and so on. Whereas in a narrative review, you wouldn't have this process. So there are key features of systematic reviews that prevent the type of biases and shortcomings that I've mentioned before from being introduced into the process. And I'll just go over a few of these. So one of them is that the review has to have a clear set of objectives. It's much easier to have a final product that makes more sense, or to carry it out in a systematic way, if what you want to do is clear. And this is just an example of two different reviews. So the top one, Nutrition in Pregnancy, Mineral and Vitamin Supplements, is a narrative review written by one person. And so this is another key thing, is that you can never have a systematic review that's only written by one person. You need at least two people to do a systematic review. And their objective for the paper was, they say, this paper discusses minerals and trace elements as well as fat and water-soluble vitamins in pregnancy, their concentrations, the requirements for them, the consequences of their deficiency, and the functional effects of supplementation with them. So we can see that they're trying to do a lot in this one review, whereas the review below is on vitamin A supplementation in pregnancy, and they have a more defined and clear set of objectives, which is to review the effects of supplementation of vitamin A or one of its derivatives during pregnancy, alone or in combination with other vitamins and nutrients, on maternal and newborn clinical outcomes. Another feature of reviews, of systematic reviews, is that they have explicit and reproducible methodology. So somebody should be able to read the method section of a systematic review and be able to do exactly the same thing in another review. One of the key methodological steps is to have predefined criteria to decide which studies are eligible to be included in the review. This is just a snapshot as an example of a review on internet-based interventions for smoking cessation. And you can clearly see that they outline in the method section of the review what types of studies are going to be included, what types of participants must be studied in the studies included, what types of interventions they're looking at, and what outcome measures they're interested in reporting in the review. Also, in terms of methodology, they will show a comprehensive search strategy for any systematic review. And here we can see, so this is the same review on internet-based interventions for smoking cessation, where they specify all the databases where they're going to search, where they've searched. They're going to also search clinical trial registries for ongoing studies. They're going to contact authors and experts in the field to try to find unpublished work. So they're trying to cover all the bases in terms of trying to find all the potential relevant evidence to include in the review, not focusing only on published studies and not focusing, so trying to get a comprehensive search. They will also assess the validity of the study findings and assess the methodological quality of the studies that are included in the review, which I've mentioned has to do with the trustworthiness of these studies and whether you trust the results or not. So this is just a section of the review that describes how they were going to assess the risk of bias in the studies included in the review. In this case, they were using the Cochrane Risk of Bias tool. And in the review, they will present the summary of this assessment, and also it will influence the interpretation of the findings of the review. And then finally, they will have another feature of a key feature of a systematic review is there will be an appropriate quantitative and qualitative synthesis of the findings in the review. It should clearly describe if the data was synthesized, how it was synthesized, what methods were used, if a meta-analysis was done, what were the requirements for a meta-analysis to be conducted, what models were used, and so forth. And then there will be a systematic and complete presentation of the findings in the review. So in this example, Cochrane reviews will have a section that describes all the studies included in the review, where they were conducted, on which populations, what type of interventions were included in the studies in a bit more detail. And then there will be a separate section looking at the effects of the interventions on all the outcomes that are relevant for the review. And usually the reviews will have a structured way of presenting this. So really, when we look at a systematic review, this allegory of the 7 blind mice kind of puts it in perspective. So if you have the 7 blind mice looking at an elephant, and everyone has a different perspective of the elephant, but one sees a pillar, the other sees a snake, a spear, a fan, a cliff, a rope. They all see different things, but the one standing on top can have an overview of the elephant and understand it for what it is. And the same is true of a systematic review. And it goes back to also what Jimmy was saying about, the danger of a single study. You don't want to look at a single effect from a single study. You want to have an overview of all the studies that have looked at a particular question to truly understand what the evidence says about a particular treatment, a particular drug, and so forth. So now that we've spoken a bit about systematic reviews and why they are important, it is also important to distinguish a systematic review from a meta-analysis. So from the world of reviews out there, you have that big circle which represents all the reviews, and the white part is the reviews that are not systematic, so the narrative reviews. A smaller portion of that will be your systematic reviews, and some of those reviews will include meta-analyses. So a meta-analysis is a statistical procedure that integrates the results of several independent studies that are considered to be combinable. And the key here is the combinable. So it may be appropriate to do a meta-analysis as part of a systematic review if the studies are combinable. If they are not, then you will have a systematic review without a meta-analysis. But ideally, you don't want a meta-analysis outside of the context of a systematic review. And a meta-analysis is illustrated using a forest plot. And we're just going to go over one forest plot from this review looking at internet-based interventions for smoking cessation, just to try to unpack what the forest plot means. This is just the PICO of this review, just to give us a better understanding of what the review was looking at. So they were looking at current smokers of any age, gender, or ethnicity, and they're looking at interactive, tailored, and non-interactive internet interventions that focused on standard approaches to information delivery in all settings and from all types of providers, compared to no treatment or to other forms of treatments, for example, like self-help booklets. And they were looking as the primary outcome on smoking cessation at least 6 months after the intervention started. So this is one of their forest plots. And to try and unpack it a bit, we start with a question: what is the comparison that this forest plot is looking at? And that's usually in the heading, in the title of the forest plot. And we can see here, it says comparison 3, internet plus behavioral support versus non-internet based non-active control. So basically, there's nothing happening. And you can also see in the forest plot, there will be a column for the internet group, which is the intervention group, and a column for the no internet group, which is the control group. We then need to try to understand what's the outcome that the forest plot is looking at. So here we can see in the heading, smoking cessation at 6 months plus follow-up in adults. So we can usually get this from the title of the forest plot also, is that they're looking at smoking cessation. That is the outcome. How many studies are included in the forest plot? So this will find on the left-hand side of a forest plot. This one is probably the same study. This Brendrian 2008 is probably one study that has 2 different arms. But you can see here that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 studies that have been included in this particular forest plot, in this particular meta-analysis. And along the line of each study, you will see the number of participants that had the outcome. So 29 participants here stopped smoking out of 144 participants in the group. And then for the control group, we can see that there were 10 participants that stopped smoking out of 146 participants in that arm for that particular study, Brendrian 2008A. Along the line, you will see the effect measure, which we'll get to in just a moment. But so for each study, you will have the individual results along the line of the study. Then we need to understand what is the effect measure that's being reported in the forest plot. And this you usually see here in the middle where you have this line and on the right-hand side. So this forest plot is looking at risk ratios, which is looking at the risk in the intervention group compared to the risk in the control group. So the risk ratio, because it's a proportion, it means that if the risk is the same in the intervention and in the control group, your risk ratio will be 1. So this one here and this line represent the line of no effect. And it means that if the risk ratio falls on the line, it means that there is no difference between internet-based intervention versus a control on smoking cessation. But if the risk is increased, so if it falls on this side of the plot, it means that the risk in the intervention is greater than the risk in the control. So for example, okay, we'll get to that a bit later. So I want to point out though that we're looking here at a positive outcome. So smoking cessation is a good thing. We want people to stop smoking. That's why we want, if the risk is increased in this case, it's a good thing and it favors the intervention. So it means that the internet-based interventions are working to make people stop smoking. If the risk of this outcome is reduced, it would fall on this side, and it would mean that with the internet intervention, people would be worse off in terms of smoking cessation compared to not doing anything. And so that's kind of how you look. But if we're looking at negative outcomes, say, for example, like death, you don't want the risk ratio to be high because it would mean that there is an increased risk of death with the intervention compared to the control. So that's just to keep that distinction. So you have to look at what the effect measure is and what kind of outcome that you're looking at. So how do we understand what the effect of the intervention is? And we can just start by looking at this one study that was included in this meta-analysis. So this is Brendrian 2008. What is the risk of smoking cessation in the participants that received the internet and behavioral support? We can see it's 29 out of 144 people that were in that group, right? What is the risk in the control group? We can see it's 10 people that stopped smoking out of the 146 in that control group. So what is the risk ratio for that particular study? So what is the risk of smoking cessation with the internet and behavioral support intervention compared to a control where there was no intervention? And so this will be the risk in the one group over the risk in the other group, which gives us a risk ratio of 2.9, which is equivalent to what is there on the graph. And so this just means that the internet and behavioral support increases the risk, in quotes, of smoking cessation at 6 months plus, almost 3 times more compared to not doing anything, compared to not receiving an intervention. Besides that effect measure, we also need to look at the confidence interval. So this is what is in brackets after your risk ratio measure, which in this case is 1.49 at the lower end and 5.81 at the higher end. And this essentially means that the risk of smoking cessation with the internet and behavioral support intervention can increase by as little as 1.5 times or by as much as 5.8 times compared to not receiving the intervention. We see that this confidence interval does not cross that line of no effect that I mentioned earlier. So if you look at the summary of the effect is in this little dot and dash for the study. So the little dot here in the middle represents the 2.49, the risk ratio measure, and the line represents the confidence interval, where this lower end of the line represents the 1.49, and the upper end of the confidence interval represents the 5.81 end of the confidence interval. And so the risk ratio could range from 1.49 to 5.8, but all of it is on the right side of the graph, doesn't touch the line of no effect, which means that there is a statistically different effect of the internet and behavior support intervention on smoking cessation compared to the control. Then we will look at, so that was just the example of how to interpret the risk ratio for the one study. But then what we want to look in a forest plot is at the pooled results. And the pooled result is represented by the little diamond at the bottom. And it's also represented in the risk ratio value on the right-hand side. So if you look at a line that's going vertically on this diamond, it represents the risk ratio of 1.69. And the confidence interval is the horizontal line where this end of the diamond represents the risk ratio of 1.3, and this end of the diamond represents the risk ratio of 2.18. So it's the horizontal line represents the confidence interval. And this can show us that, you know, this is where all data from all these 5 studies were pooled to find out what is the pooled risk ratio when you consider the evidence from all these 5 studies. And it is showing us, because there's an increased risk because it's above 1, right? So there's a 69% increased risk in smoking cessation among those participants that receive internet-based interventions with behavioral support compared to those that don't receive an intervention. And we can see that the risk increases by as little as 1.3, so 30% increase in the risk of smoking cessation, up to two times increase in the risk of smoking cessation. So that's what the overall, the pooled estimate will tell you. So the interpretation is the same as for the individual studies, but this is just pooling all the data from these trials, and in a way, it gives you a more precise measure, because you can see that a lot of these confidence intervals are much wider, as represented by the line and how long the lines are, compared to this little diamond at the bottom. By pooling the data, we are kind of creating a large trial. It's as if there was a large trial done on 1,368 people in an intervention group and 966 people in the control group. And it gives you a more confidence in the estimate, because it allows you to have a better power to detect the effect. I've spoken a lot. I know we have 5 minutes to go, and I had one practice slide that I wanted to see if maybe we can go over. I think I need to escape my presentation, though. because what I wanted was to display this and see if you can type in the message box what the different components of the forest plot are. So if I could ask you, I mean, it's difficult. So this is a forest plot looking at hydroxychloroquine compared to standard care or placebo that's available from the COVID NMA website. And this is so a living review looking at the effects of hydroxychloroquine for treating COVID-19. And I thought we'd do a practice run of this to see how clear the explanation of what a forest plot is and the different parts of it were understood. So I'm just trying to see how I can see the chat. And I wanted to start. So Michelle, do you see my GoToMeeting window?
Yes, I can also see the chat if that's any help.
Okay, maybe you can do that, because then I can't see the chat and the slide at the same time.
Yeah.
The wonders of technology. Sorry, no, I must change this. Okay, no, this is not. Okay, can you see the full slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so then would somebody be able to tell me what the outcome is that we're looking at in this slide? And you can just type it in the message box, or you can say it. What outcome are we looking at?
Hi Solange, it's Joan speaking. Is it whether hydroxychloroquine has any impact on death for COVID patients with their diet?
Yes, so we can see here on the top, under pharmacological treatments, it says all-cause mortality, day 14 to 28. So this is looking at all-cause mortality on these patients with COVID-19 that are given hydroxychloroquine compared to those given standard care or placebo. It's specifically looking at death between 14 and 28 days after treatment. And then this forest plot looks slightly different. It's a bit more confusing because, for example, if you're not on the website, you can't see what intervention is and what intervention 2 is. Can you tell me how many studies are included in the forest plot? I'm not sure if anyone's. So we can see on the left-hand side, we have the lists of the studies that are included in the forest plot. And we have here different categories. So they've got Skipper, Mitra, Chen, Cavalcanti, Tang, Horby. So it's 8 studies that are included in the forest plot.
Gopalan gave us the correct answer in the chat. Yes,
okay. Thanks, Gopalan. Thank you. Yes, that's correct. But you can see here that they have they've separated this into mild and moderate. So a population with mild disease versus a population with moderate to severe disease. Here they mix it all up. And so we can see that there is an effect measure for those 2 studies where the population had mild disease compared to this effect measure at the bottom here that's looking at a mixed population of mild to severe to critical disease. So can you tell me what the effect measure is that they are reporting in this forest plot? So one hint is that it's the same as we were looking at just now. So if you're looking on the right-hand side of the forest plot, it's the risk ratio with the 95% confidence interval that we can see on that column there. And that's also represented by these values here in the middle. What we can see in this plot is that actually there were a lot of studies where no death occurred. So you don't really have risk ratios for those studies because there are actually no outcome. So that's an interesting thing. So in effect, we have two studies here contributing data. Can you tell me what is the pooled effect measure? What is the risk ratio for the mixed population pooled analyses? So if you're looking at not this top pool data, which is looking at population with mild disease, but this chunk of data that's coming from studies that have patients that have mild to critical disease, what is the pooled risk ratio for that population for death?
It's the 1.07.
Yes. And what does yeah.
Sorry, I was just wondering if you were to write this out in an article, for example, would it be more accurate to say between 0.97 and like from like about 1 to 1.2, or is it better to just say what the
I think we look at both and they tell us different things. So the effect measure, the risk ratio, is telling us that there's a 7% increased risk of death in patients that take hydroxychloroquine, right? But then we look at the confidence interval to see how the word is escaping me. How precise that measure is. And the confidence interval is going to tell us that the true effect lies somewhere between 0.97, which is a 3% reduction in the risk of death, and 19% increase in the risk of death in patients that receive chloroquine compared to those that receive standard care or placebo. So this crosses this line of no effect, which means in essence that there is no difference. So you are right to say that if we say there's a 7% increased risk, we might be misinterpreting it because we then need to look at the 95% confidence interval to see, does this show us, is this precise enough? Is this effect precise enough? Or is it, or does it cross the line of no effect? And so the effect might be anywhere between a 3% reduction and a 19% increase in the risk, and it crosses the line of no effect. So that really shows that there isn't much difference between taking hydroxychloroquine or standard care for death in patients with COVID.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I know there was a question about the confidence intervals, and I'm not sure if my explanation just now made it clearer or not.
Hi, Solange. Yeah, I asked about the confidence intervals. So the thing is, I understand them conceptually, but the problem I always have is explaining their importance in an article. And I mean, I think maybe you might understand that given how you were just trying to explain it now as well. I don't know, it's a difficult concept for me to convey, but I think it's an important concept to include when you're reporting on research. So I was wondering, do you have any examples of, I don't know, papers or popular articles that do a good job of explaining confidence intervals to a non-academic audience?
I don't have any that come to mind right now, but I can certainly find one to send, and Jimmy might have something to say as well. I do think that whenever you're reporting on any effect measure, you can't just look at the effect measure itself. Otherwise, in this case, we would conclude that hydroxychloroquine increases the risk of death by 7%. But actually, that's not true, because if you look at the confidence interval, it crosses the line of no effect. It could range, the effect could range from a 3% reduction to a 19% increase in risk of death. So you can't just rely on the effect measure. And so they need to be taken into account. And in essence, the conclusion here is that there is no difference, because even though the estimate is saying something, the confidence interval is giving us a different view of that effect estimate. Jimmy, do you have anything to add? Perhaps a better way of explaining the confidence interval.
I think we may have lost Prof.
Yeah, I think we have.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But I think we can see if we can find something that would be helpful.
Yes, definitely. I can look for there is some stuff that's been written in sort of layman's terms that might be easier to understand, and I can try to find that and send and share that.
Gopalang also had a question about risk ratios. In asking, does that mean the probability of an outcome happening, a risk or risk ratio?
Oh gosh, I think that's a question for a statistician. So it's not really probability, because probability in statistics means something else, but I don't know that I can. We should invite a statistician the next time. It just means that it is looking at what is the proportion of events in the one group compared to the other, compared to the number of people that are there, tell you what the risk is. So it's looking at the risk in one group. So compared to the risk in the other group. I think probability has a slightly different meaning, but I think if you're thinking in general terms, yes, there is higher risk, so there's higher probability that people that receive hydroxychloroquine, or in example that we're looking at before, that people that receive the internet-based intervention to stop smoking are more likely to stop smoking compared to those that don't receive anything.
Yeah.
So in general terms, that's what it means, but not statistically.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, Solange. Yeah, it's I think it's the difficulty with translating it into, again, just a non-technical language, because I think generally when people hear risk, you think it's a bad thing. So
Yeah.
just reading that, you'd be like, oh, the risk of death means like I'm going to die, as opposed to, I don't know. Yeah. So I guess my struggle again is translating it into everyday language.
So I think in the case of the other slide that was looking at the smoking cessation, I mean, here for the risk of death, it's not that much of a problem, because it's saying your risk of dying doesn't change whether you're taking hydroxychloroquine or taking standard care or placebo, right? And risk is appropriately sort of used for that. But when we talk about risk for a positive outcome like smoking cessation, then it can become a bit more complicated. And I think the way we can say this is, there's you're 69% more likely to stop smoking at 6 months if you receive the internet with a behavioral support. Is that clear?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, you're 69% more likely to stop smoking if you receive the intervention. So we have to alter the language a little bit. I just use the risk because that is, in statistics, that's what the risk ratio means. But you would change it a little bit to convey the message a bit more clearly.
So Michelle again, but we are a little over time. But obviously, if there are some important questions that Solange might be able to assist with, I'm sure she won't mind going a little over time. So if there is anything, please ask it now. Looks like it's all been very clear. Am I making the right assumption?
Or too confusing.
Or too confusing, yeah, exactly. So, Solange, anything else
We will try to find some resources to share. Yeah, no.
Yeah. But if there aren't any further questions, then yeah, we can probably call this session to a close.
I'll stop sharing.
Yes, and thank you all for attending. And obviously, if something comes up that you only think about afterwards, please feel free to send us a question by email or something, and we'll try and help as much as we can to find a decent answer.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle and Solange, and also Prof. Volmink in his absence. Thank you so much. It's been a very easily digestible way to get this information. Thank you.
Great, good, thank you. Okay, thanks. And I have made a recording, so I'll make that available to you as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, otherwise, yes.
Thanks so much.
Everyone have a good weekend.
Thanks. Michelle, I've contacted Health E, so hopefully I'll get back to you with an answer about the Health E session by the end of today.
That sounds good.
Thank
you.
We'll be on the same chat.
Perfect. Cool. Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Good weekend. Bye.